What's something that mentally and emotionally broke you? Filing my dad's bankruptcy, getting him diagnosed for early onset Alzheimer's, dementia, and being his primary caregiver. It completely reverses the father-son role in a way I was not prepared for. Better now, but still is heartbreaking. As someone who has dealt directly with a parent having early onset Alzheimer's, ensure that you are setting up proper care for them that isn't centered around you. It will destroy you to continue to do so day in and out. It only gets harder to care for Alzheimer's patients as the disease progresses, but we put a lot of onus and guilt on ourselves as direct family to care for them day in, day out. My dad had to do this to his mom. They're immigrants from Poland, and she lost all the ability to speak English and would only communicate in broken Polish, mostly nonsense, but some coherent sentences would come out every now and then. Due to Polish not being super common in nursing homes, it was a risk that she'd be mistreated due to communication issues, and he took her in, built an apartment unit in his basement, and provided her with care until the end of her life. And I'm terrified that this will happen to my dad, and eventually me and my sons will have to take care of me. My dad would have to change his mom's diaper, and I can't imagine my sons doing it for me. I can't fathom what that must have been like to go through. My dad is in his mid-60s, and about 6 years ago he had a full mental breakdown while at work one day. He had to take a leave of absence to try and get his head right, and after seeing numerous therapists, getting on multiple forms of medication, he's still not back to his old self. My dad was always more socially and emotionally withdrawn, but had a carefree attitude and was still great to hang out with. Since his episode 6 years back, he's never been the same. He's constantly anxious, struggles in social gatherings even with family, and at one point it was so bad early on that he couldn't even go grocery shopping without having a full-blown panic attack. I've reluctantly come to accept the fact that my dad as I knew him is gone and is never coming back. Stay strong, bud. My first recommendation would be to get a power of attorney while he still has some sense of self. Hire a lawyer to review his will and any end-of-life wishes. Look into becoming an executor. If he has a car, make sure you get a new title with a transfer on death tag. You'll also want to make sure you're on any bank accounts he still has open, if he doesn't already have one, and if you can afford it, take out a life insurance policy on him. So, I had a similar situation with my father. Mom passed away in 2012. And the day she passed, I had to bring Dad to the hospital. One of the stents in his right leg went out a month prior. He had been dragging it around while working at the warehouse during the day and then trying to take care of her in the evening. He went through an extensive surgery and was bedridden for over a month. Luckily, my employer allowed me to stay an extra few weeks to take care of him and get everything sorted after Mom's funeral or wake. Dad was eventually forced into early retirement later that year. I hated the idea of him living alone, so I moved him out to live with me in California. We ended up moving back home in 2014, and I continued to take care of him until he passed away last year. I won't sugarcoat it and tell you that it was easy. It most certainly wasn't. Him and I got along just fine, and the experience allowed us to bond in ways that we hadn't before, but being a caretaker is draining on every front. The last few years were the toughest. He had his leg amputated in 2019 and was diagnosed with COPD. He didn't really take to PD and refused to use his prosthetic, so we was bound to his wheelchair. He was also on oxygen all of the time. His overall health and cognition progressively declined over the next 3 years. My sister and I thought it was Alzheimer's or dementia, but all scans came back negative. He needed constant supervision and help with just about everything, especially when he lost the physical ability to transfer out of his wheelchair. There were lots of bathroom and bathing accidents, a few trips to the ER due to slips and falls, and lots of tension in between. I looked at nursing homes and assisted living around our area. The good ones were full or were too expensive, and everything else was questionable and seemed to have numerous complaints. I've seen enough videos and news articles about elder abuse, and did not want to chance it with him, especially during COVID. Seeing him in that state towards the end of his life did a number on me, and I constantly questioned my patience and fortitude. I fought every single thought of self-pity and resentment, but those selfish thoughts would get through from time to time. I would overcome them every single time, but they will wear you down eventually. None of it seemed fair, especially for him. He was a great father growing up and deserved to live until the end of his life in dignity, but I couldn't 100% preserve that for him. He was admitted to the hospital for confusion and breathing issues in February 2022. He was then intubated a week later due to pneumonia. One night, he suffered a heart attack and was gone for 20 minutes before they brought him back. But he suffered severe brain damage. When the doctors said there was no chance of him coming back, I made the decision to move him to Comfort Care. My sister and I were with him while he passed peacefully on March 12, 2022. For you, find help where you can. Any help whatsoever. My sister, brother-in-law, and I all moved in together after his amputation in 2019. I still did most of the heavy lifting, but I had them in my corner for when things got tough. If you don't have friends or family to assist you, then look at what your state can offer. If he's bankrupt and doesn't have many assets or life savings, then he may qualify for Medicaid or other financial assistance to get into a nursing home or assisted living. This will be difficult, but know you aren't alone. Feel free to DM anytime. They say that the day you grow up is when you realize your parents can no longer do anything for you. 14 years ago, my father had a stroke that rendered him unable to care for himself and started developing dementia, not Alzheimer's though. We had to manage his business ourselves and keep it running just to shut it down and pay the employees their severance package. Watching him deteriorate over the years was a war of attrition in the back of everyone's head in the family. Upkeeping his quality of life and care became an entire enterprise on its own. He passed away peacefully 2 years ago, but looking back at all those years is like analyzing the progression of the compound interest of exhaustion in your brain. Till this day, I still get slightly envious and nostalgic when I see any friend of mine receiving advice from their father. Sending hugs, man. My family is going through this with my grandmother. It's made me appreciate just how strong my mother really is. My grandmother endured a lot in her late 80s, from burying her grandson and son much too early to losing her independence, and having to sell the home her husband had built and they had lived in for 50-odd years. Then on top of that, she's had 2 hip replacements, one recently at the age of 93. So she has had to regain her ability to walk, and she is just mentally out of the game. I think COVID hit while she was in independent living, and she went from having a bit of a social life and still more or less taking care of herself to becoming isolated and immobile, and I think that's what pushed her dementia to where it is now. Now my mother and her 2 sisters take turns taking care of my grandmother, which includes making sure she gets her physical therapy, takes her medicine, and doesn't overdose on Tylenol, which she is constantly asking for. She'd take a bottle in just the morning if she were able to get her hands on a full one. She just forgets she's taken it, and in her head for some reason thinks it will help. I think my grandmother more or less understands her situation, and is frustrated and depressed, and I've heard her mumbling many times asking God to just let her die. But in the end, her heart is healthy, she doesn't have cancer, she could go on to live to 100 or older, and it wouldn't surprise her doctors. My mother just went through this with my grandmother over the past 2 years. A few weeks ago, my grandmother ended up falling and breaking her hip, so combined with her worsening dementia, we were left with basically no choice but to put her in an assisted living facility. Before that, my mom was taking care of her near 24/7 for over a year. My thoughts and prayers. No one understands how difficult the situation is until they've actually lived through it. Alzheimer's, dementia is a horrific illness, and I pray they find a viable cure, or at least treatment, for it in the coming years. Moved my dad into a nursing home a few months back. Prior to that, he lived with us for 13 years. My wife and I have been married for 13.5 years. She's a saint, by the way. He worked and managed on his own for the most part, but if he tried to move out on his own, everything fell apart. Then he retired and his health plummeted. Just before he left, he couldn't walk more than 20 feet with resting and could only stand for a minute or two. He spent 90% of his time in a recliner. He's been of sound mind this whole time, but it is like watching him slowly give up and die. What is staggering is he was a different man when I was a kid. Head of the household, owned a home, was the number 2 guy at his job just under the owner. Then he left my mom, and it's been a 22-year slide to this. I was about to tell him he had to move in early 2020, but kicking a 70-year-old out in the middle of a pandemic is a bit callous, so we held off. Telling him he had to move out was the hardest thing I've ever had to do. I knew not seeing his grandkids and our dog would make him so sad. Still wrecks me. I hope this didn't come off as a one-up post. Your comment moved me to tell my story. I don't know exactly what you are going through, but just know I hope you and your dad are doing okay. My boyfriend is dealing with nursing homes right now. I've learned something. Someone has to come around every day. Without an advocate, I don't trust these places. The way things stand, my father will pass before he ends up in a nursing home. He will be cared for by his wife and myself. My stepmother, she might live to 100. She has her long-term care in order, but she has no idea what happens in these places. I can't let her go out that way. We are not terribly close, but she deserves better than that. Now I'm worried about how this will go. Having a mother with schizophrenia. Such a tough illness for someone to experience, and tough on a family. My dad has schizoaffective bipolar. I made it to 37 with just depression as my diagnosis. I thought I had dodged it. The one thing I'm grateful for is that I decided not to pass on these genes. I would never risk the pain I grew up with or am experiencing now being passed on to another human being. I will continue to answer questions as I'm able. But I just got a room at the ER, so I'm going to stop distracting myself and focus on me for a bit. Thanks for the well wishes, best of luck to everyone, and I'm sorry for the misstep. My mom was depressed and felt isolated by my dad and her side of the family, so she was pretty abusive towards me and my sister. Then eventually something broke in her and she was experiencing psychosis. She was held in a mental hospital 3 times over the course of 6 months. I had to watch her talk to herself, threaten us with knives, and she even tried to stab my eye out with car keys. I had to make sure my door was locked at night before I went to bed. It's been about 10 years now, and the memories of it are still burned into my brain. She's doing okay now, but she's just a shell of herself, so if she were to die today, I wouldn't be sad. To me, she already died 10 years ago. I am schizophrenic, was diagnosed at 25, and it basically ruined my life. I was valedictorian, went to a good university, 4.0 my Ivy League master's degree, and was going to get a PAAAHDAADDDDHEHE. Instead, I went insane, became an alcoholic, and tried to myself 3 times before moving back in with my parents for the next 6 years. I could barely hold a job for more than a month or 2. It took me 14 different meds to finally find a combination that allows me some semblance of basic functionality. Now I'm a zombie half the time due to meds, but on good days I can read and write like I used to. Still don't know if I'll ever hold a job though. Reminds me of what happened to my mom. A few months after they got engaged, a drunk driver hit him while he was crossing the street on a university campus. I'm impressed my mom even kept going at that point in her life, because not long before that she came home to her dorm to find her college roommate had died in her bed while she was out. The scary part is thinking, if her fiancé hadn't been Ed, would I have ever existed? Also, for those wondering about the driver, pretty sure he got his license suspended for a year but otherwise got off mostly scot-free. I had meningitis as a baby. The doctor dismissed my mother multiple times as just a new mother worrying about nothing. Ended up hospitalized, got the pneumonia, had to have my tiny lungs drained multiple times. Doctors who dismiss signs of meningitis should be criminally liable for their failure to treat it. Tests came back negative? Gee, if only we knew in advance that the instant tests are notoriously unreliable, and the more reliable tests take so long that you'll probably be dead or permanently severely disabled by the time the positive result comes back. Oh wait, we do know all of that. They know bacterial meningitis can end hours. It's gross negligence to not start a precautionary round of antibiotics when symptoms are presenting. Pissing around waiting for a definitive diagnosis is nothing but the doctor passing a death sentence. Hearing my mom ask if it was going to hurt to die. Few minutes later she took her last breath, squeezed my hand, and a slow release. Am I okay? Nah, a year and a half later I'm still not. My grandpa had undiagnosed Alzheimer's or dementia. He was a witty guy, always joking with everyone. He was also a big guy, about 6'2" and a solid 200 plus lbs. Towards the end, he was a shadow of what he was, physically and mentally. Towards the end, he was a husk of a human. I saw him about a year before his death, before it really went downhill. He didn't recognize me. He didn't recognize anyone. He lost most of his memories, but from time to time, he would remember something and live it out without any awareness of the present. For example, he once told me to feed his horse and started getting angry when I didn't do it. My dad told me to just get some grass and throw it in front of his truck, which seemed to calm him down. What really got me, though I never witnessed it, is that he would have moments of sobriety and self-awareness. My grandma said he would instantaneously snap back to reality, express fears of death, and start to cry. These bouts of consciousness only lasted a few minutes, and they became less frequent as his illness progressed. It's as if his mind was desperately trying to break free. He was trapped in his own body. Last day of my mom dealing with liver failure, she had been moaning and crying all day about pain and how unfair it was. She wasn't a drinker, it was just bad luck with the liver. I was alone and she cried to me about being in pain and scared of dying. I told her that at least where you are headed there is no pain. She grabbed my hand, kissed it, and didn't make another sound until she passed an hour later. I was so close to her and she was so supportive of me. I'm glad I got to help her in the end. But the last few days with her was so tough. My first experience with death was my mom. My dad died 8 weeks later of heart failure, literal died of a broken heart. It's Aldo ed me up, but I don't have the energy to tell that story. I miss my mom so much. My mom had a few months to prepare for her death and was in the care of hospice. I was expecting her to go peacefully in her sleep after she had been unconscious for a couple days. Her final hours were horrific. After the peace we had the previous days, she was wide awake, had terminal agitation, appeared to have a stroke, and was choking on her own blood. As I was holding her to keep her from hurting herself, I was praying for her to die so she could be at peace. I'm glad I was there for her, but it was an experience I will never forget. I'm glad my other siblings did not witness what happened. I think they would have really struggled. I think often about ing myself, and reading things like this remind me the only person who would care, my little brother, would probably himself too. We're both terminally mentally ill, and I know I am one of his reasons that he doesn't do it. I think I hate our parents who allowed us to become like this. I also have a few Ireland friends that I think would be devastated. Boyfriend, though I don't really feel like I have any reason to live, and like all of this is just emotion I go through waiting until I die. Therapy and medication resistant too. I was diagnosed with clinical or major depression, meaning meds and nothing can compel me to feel different. I quit drinking and realized drinking gave my life highs and lows that it was lacking without. And sober, I feel much closer to ing myself. I can't hardly think of a reason not to accept my kid and brother. At the same time, though, it is easier to think they would be better off without me. I think for most people the problems y'all have are easily solved, usually surrounding bad habits or tragedy. But for me there isn't actually a solution to this. I hope to eventually attain a position in which I work only 2-3 days a week and spend the rest of my time in isolation. I have surgeries and other things for transition I want to get done. And then I just want to live alone quietly for the rest of my days until I die, only working the bare minimum to pay for rent and no utilities. I will literally just live in a dead house until I die in said room. I hope that it is painless. I have guns, so I hope the natural cause I die of is ultimately painless, because I would have opted for the bullet if I knew it was gonna hurt. I was in therapy and was nervous about my child's upcoming birthday party because of serious anxiety issues. She told me to imagine the worst thing happening, and when the party is over I would realize everything was okay. Day of birthday party, I received an out-of-state call from a coroner. My mom was found dead in her apartment. An investigation occurred, but it was determined she had a diabetic episode, hit her head on the kitchen counter, bled out, and died. An hour later, my friend arrived, hysterically crying, indicating she just got a call her mom died. I was numb and broken. Life has never been the same since. When the police told me my fiancé had been ed by a drunk driver immediately outside of our neighborhood, it didn't help that the police lost the driver in the hospital, letting him escape for about 30 hours. I was fortunate to have a great network of friends and family to support me. Part of what really helped me was giving up on the idea of justice or that things can be made right. That helped me sever the tie to the accident, acknowledge my fiancé, and remember her for her life and not her death. Additionally, my parents and I established a scholarship in my fiancé's honor for students like her, young women in STEM fields. That helped me keep her memory alive and salvage some of the goodness in the world we lost when she was taken from us. Watching my grandma on my mom's side go through hospice. I have never seen a human slowly deteriorate like that. I was happy to think I would get to spend some time with her and comfort her because the year prior my other grandma died unexpectedly and I never got to say bye. As each day went on, she slowly lost any ability to think or properly communicate to the point that it was like her mind was already gone. When she was close to death, she was making these gargling sounds that sounded like she was drowning. That sound alone is something I will never forget. It was the worst experience of death I have ever experienced. It was literally watching a person you loved just slowly fade away mentally. The amount of weight she lost in just those few days. The hospice should have provided some literature for you to read so that you would know what to expect and hopefully be less traumatized by it. The human body goes through definite stages as it is dying, and it helped me to recognize what was happening and why. The first sign is usually that they stop eating. They lose their appetite, and even if you persuade them to eat or drink something, they throw it up. The body knows it no longer needs nutrients or energy from food. That gargling noise you heard is known as the death rattle and is caused by secretions in the airway. It is an awful sound and is one of the final stages of dying. The person's respiratory system is too weak to cough or swallow those secretions, and it usually starts a few hours before death. There is something bittersweet about watching a loved one die like that. On one hand, it's hard to watch. On the other hand, you can take comfort in knowing that they didn't die alone and were surrounded by people who loved them. You can also take comfort in knowing that she was made comfortable while she was in hospice. She was not in any pain or distress. Don't be afraid to do it again. Each experience can be quite different. My husband's parents passed away when he was young. The aunt who raised him was surrounded by her husband, daughter, Sil, my husband, and me. She had been unconscious for days and suddenly woke up, raised her head, and looked around completely alert. Each of the 5 of us got the chance to look her in the eyes, kiss her, and tell her we loved her. Then she put her head back down and was gone. It's something I've always been grateful to have experienced. It's not too late for you to get some help from the hospice. Most have grief support groups for the families of their former patients. You might want to try it. I found it helpful. When I was 13 and told my family that I'd been raped by a grown man that had taken me and 2 other underage friends of mine to a motel to roofie us, my grandmother scowled at me with disgust as I sat there with my tail between my legs feeling more shame than I'd ever felt. She told me I needed to learn how to keep my legs closed. I got a huge talking to from the adults and was punished and slut-shamed. I'm 31 now, and the thought of this still gives me a pain in my chest. Not getting the proper medical attention I knew I needed, not feeling heard by medical professionals. I had a horrific case of food poisoning, Campylobacter, which is actually fairly common but presented abnormally in me. Doctors and urgent care kept telling me I was probably just pregnant, which there was no way at that time for that to be possible. Begging for tests to be done but being denied because I was probably pregnant. I couldn't eat or drink anything because I would immediately start cramping and faint. This went on for a week before I found an that did a CT scan and tests and discovered the bacteria. I thought I was dying. I used to enjoy baking. I thought I was devout at it. Mostly followed recipes, but I would tweak them to try and improve. Most my friends seemed to respond positively, and not just in a being nice way. They'd actually ask when the next time I'd be making thing they liked was. But in anger, the person I trusted most wanted to hurt me and said I wasn't that good. People were just being nice about it, but the standard pre-made stuff was better and my tweaks made things worse. I haven't really done any baking since. It just ate any love I had for it. I still cook. I enjoy cooking. I just don't do baking anymore. The desire died that day.